She arrived with a trunk, a marriage license, and a name she didn't recognize as her husband's. And within 60 seconds of stepping onto that porch, a 12-year-old boy pointed a rifle at her chest. "You ain't our mother," he said, "and you never will be." Most women would have climbed right back onto that stagecoach. Most women would have called the whole arrangement a mistake and never looked back. Evelyn Mercer was not most women. But standing in the dirt of Dry Hollow, staring down the barrel of a boy's gun, she wasn't sure she was brave enough either. If you've ever had to walk into a place where nobody wanted you and build something out of nothing anyway, this story is for you. Stay until the end, like this video, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach from Millhaven ran twice a week, and it was never on time. On a Wednesday in late October, it arrived 40 minutes late into the settlement of Dry Hollow, kicking up a curtain of pale dust that coated everything within 20 feet. The water trough, the hitching post, the two old men playing checkers outside Danner's general store who didn't bother to look up. Evelyn Mercer was the only passenger to step off. She was 26 years old, 5'4" in her boots, and she had not slept properly in 3 days. Her dark hair was pinned back too tight, the way it always was when she was nervous, and her traveling dress, the good one, the gray wool, had a smear of axle grease on the left sleeve from when the coach wheel had needed fixing outside of Pickett's Crossing. She hadn't noticed it until now, standing in the open air of a town she'd never seen, in front of people who were quietly watching her with the particular blankness of frontier folk sizing up a stranger. She hated that she noticed the grease now, of all the things to think about. She pulled her trunk down herself before the driver could offer, mostly because he didn't offer, and set it in the dirt and looked around at Dry Hollow for the first time. It was smaller than the letter had described, or maybe smaller wasn't the right word. It was thinner, like a place that had once been bigger and the edges had just quietly worn away. There was a main street with a mud-hardened rut down the center, a dozen buildings of varying ambition, and beyond everything, the open land of the territory rolling away in every direction under a sky that was enormous and pale and completely indifferent. She had a piece of paper in her coat pocket. She'd read it so many times that the fold lines had started to fray. Mr. Gideon Hart, Hart Family Ranch, 2 miles east on the Hollow Road. Ask at Danner's if you can't find it. She found the general store without asking. The man behind the counter was heavy-set, with a beard going gray at the jaw, and he looked at her with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to have opinions about other people's business. "I'm looking for the Hart Ranch," Evelyn said. "I understand it's east of town." The man, Danner, presumably, set down the jar he was shelving. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "You the woman from the agency?" he asked. "I'm Evelyn Mercer." She paused. "Hart, I suppose, as of last Thursday." The paperwork went through. Something passed across Danner's face. It wasn't quite pity. It was more like the expression of a man watching someone walk toward a fence they don't know is electrified. "He send a wagon for you?" "No." Danner scratched the back of his neck. "I can have my boy ride out and tell him you're here. Hart doesn't come to town much these days." "I'd rather not wait," Evelyn said. "If you could just point me toward the road." Danner pointed. She thanked him. She picked up her trunk, which was heavier than it looked because she had packed every practical thing she owned, and she walked east out of Dry Hollow under that enormous pale sky. It took her 40 minutes. By the time the Hart Ranch came into view at the end of a long, straight road, flanked by dead grass and a fence line that had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt, her arms ached and her good boots had picked up a serious coating of red-brown dust. She stopped and looked. The house was 2 stories. It had been painted white once, maybe 10 years ago, and the paint had mostly given up. The porch sagged on the left side where a support post had settled, and someone had propped it up with what appeared to be a section of old fence rail. There were 2 windows on the upper floor, one of which had a piece of burlap tacked over it instead of glass. The barn behind the house was in better shape than the house, which told her something about the man who lived here. The yard was not quite a yard. It was more a description of a yard. The general area between the house and the barn where things happened. A water pump. A chopping block with an axe left in it. A wooden cart with a broken wheel leaned against the fence. Chickens moved through it all with the total self-concern of chickens everywhere. There was a smell of wood smoke and animals and something faintly metallic that she couldn't identify. She stood at the edge of this place with her trunk in the dirt beside her and her heart doing something uncomfortable in her chest, and she thought, quite clearly, "What have I done?" Not as a question, more as a plain statement of fact. Then she picked up the trunk and walked toward the front door. She heard them before she knocked. Voices, arguing, overlapping, the specific chaos of multiple boys in an enclosed space. Something fell. Someone shouted. A door banged somewhere in the back of the house. Evelyn knocked anyway. Silence. Then footsteps, rapid, belonging to someone small, and the door swung open. The boy who opened it was about 12. He was lean and dark-haired, with his father's jaw. She would figure that out later. And eyes that were doing the very careful work of showing absolutely nothing. He was wearing a shirt with a torn collar, and he had one hand behind the door. On the barrel of a rifle, she realized after a second. He looked at her trunk. He looked at her face. "You're her," he said. "I'm Evelyn," she said. "You must be one of Gideon's boys." "Caleb." He did not move from the doorway. "Pa's out at the south pasture." He said maybe tomorrow, didn't say today. "The coach schedule changed last month. I wrote, but I think the letter may not have arrived in time." Caleb absorbed this information with no visible reaction. Behind him, she could hear the others. Movement, whispers, the sound of someone being told to shush. "So you're here now," Caleb said. "I am. And you're—" He said it flatly, without malice, but without softness either. "You're supposed to be our new mother." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. There was something very deliberate in how she held herself right then. Not rigid, not performed, just steady. "I'm your father's wife," she said. "What I am to you is going to take some time to figure out. That's true for both of us." Caleb stared at her. Whatever he'd expected her to say, it wasn't that. Then he stepped back from the doorway, and, she noticed, he moved his hand away from the rifle. She picked up her trunk and walked inside. There were 6 of them. She would learn their names and their natures in the days that followed, but that first afternoon she met them all at once in the main room of the house, and they stood in a loose arrangement that was not quite a line and not quite a crowd, watching her with the collective wariness of animals that had been startled too many times. Caleb was the eldest at 12. Next was Thomas, who was 10 and stocky and had a way of crossing his arms that made him look 40. Then Eli, 8 years old, with ears that stuck out and a habit of chewing his lower lip when he was thinking. Then Noah, 7, who stood slightly behind Eli and watched her from that partial cover. Then Samuel, who was 5 and had a cut on his chin that hadn't been cleaned properly. And then, in the kitchen doorway, she saw the youngest. He was 4 years old. He was standing on a step stool in front of the cast-iron stove, and he was trying to cook something. She could smell it from across the room. Something scorching, not quite burning yet, but working toward it. He had a wooden spoon that was bigger than his arm, and he was stirring with complete concentration, his small face furrowed with effort. "Who is he?" she asked. "Micah," Eli said. "How long has he been cooking?" A pause between them. Thomas uncrossed and recrossed his arms. "Since about noon," Noah said quietly. It was nearly 4 o'clock. Evelyn set her trunk down against the wall. She took off her coat and hung it on the peg by the door. The only empty peg, which she would understand later, was because no one had wanted to take it. She rolled up her sleeves as she walked across the room toward the kitchen. Micah heard her coming and turned around on his step stool. He was the kind of child who could have been drawn by someone who wanted to render the idea of vulnerability. Round face, wide dark eyes, a smear of something across his forehead. He looked at her with the direct, unguarded gaze of a 4-year-old who had not yet learned to disguise what he felt. "I'm making soup," he announced. Evelyn looked into the pot. It was not soup. It was water with what appeared to be cornmeal and an indeterminate amount of salt and 2 carrots that had been cut into uneven pieces, some of them very large, some of them very small, and the whole thing was beginning to stick to the bottom. "I see that," she said. She did not say, "Oh, honey," or "that's not quite right," or any of the things that would have landed wrong. She just said it plainly. "Would you mind if I helped?" Micah considered this. "You know how?" he asked. "I do." He handed her the spoon. Behind her, in the main room, she heard the 5 older boys go completely quiet. She made supper, not a feast. She didn't have the ingredients for a feast, and she wouldn't have made one anyway, because a feast on the first night would have been performance, and she was not interested in performing. She made what was in the kitchen: cornbread from the last of the cornmeal, a beef stew with dried beans, and 2 sorry-looking onions she found in a bucket by the back door, and the carrots from Micah's pot, which she finished cutting herself while he stood beside her on his step stool and watched everything she did with the intensity of a small scientist. "How come you cut them little?" he asked. "So they cook all the way through," she said. "Big pieces stay hard in the middle." "Oh." He picked up a carrot piece that hadn't made it into the pot and ate it raw, thinking about this. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn said. "What's your brother's favorite thing to eat?" Micah scrunched his face. "Thomas likes pie. Caleb doesn't like things with onions. Eli eats anything. Noah likes it when there's bread." He paused. "I like everything except beans." "Noted," she said. She filed all of it away. The boys did not help with supper. She didn't ask them to. She could feel them on the periphery. Thomas standing in the kitchen doorway for a while, then leaving. Noah drifting past twice. Caleb not coming near the kitchen at all, which told her something too. She let them move around her without comment. When the food was ready, she set it on the table and called them. They came. Slowly, with the reluctant shuffle of people who hadn't been called to a table by a woman's voice in a long time. Samuel climbed into his chair without being told and immediately knocked over his cup, which was empty, and sat there looking at it on the floor. "It's all right," Evelyn said. She picked it up and set it back on the table. They ate in silence. Not an angry silence, not a resentful silence. It was more the silence of people in shock, quiet and stunned and not quite able to process what was in front of them. The stew was good. Not transcendent, not miraculous. It was just good. Solidly, reliably good, the way food becomes when someone makes it with attention and not just obligation. Micah finished his before anyone else and pushed his bowl toward her for more. "Please," she reminded him gently. "Please," he repeated, as if the word was something he'd misplaced. She gave him more. When she looked up from ladling, she caught Thomas staring at her from across the table. He looked away immediately. She didn't acknowledge that she'd seen it. Later, she would understand that moment differently, that it was the first crack in something. But that night she was just tired, and she ate her own supper, and when the boys had gone upstairs, she cleaned the kitchen alone in the lamplight and tried not to think too hard about what came next. Gideon Hart came home at dusk. She heard the horse first, the specific sound of hooves on the hard-packed dirt of the yard, and then the silence when they stopped, and then his boots on the porch steps. Evelyn was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee. She'd made it hours ago and hadn't gotten around to drinking it. And she stood up when she heard the front door open. He was taller than she expected. That was the first thing. The photograph the agency had sent was small and blurrier and had given her no real sense of scale. And so the actual man, Gideon Hart at 41, with the particular physical density of someone who had spent 2 decades doing hard physical labor, was somehow more than she'd prepared for. He stopped in the doorway between the entry and the main room and looked at her. He had dark eyes under heavy brows, a jaw covered in several days of dark beard going gray at the corners, and the kind of face that had been weathered by sun and wind and time into something angular and uncommunicative. He was not handsome in any conventional way. He looked like the land looked, functional, worn, not concerned with how it appeared. There was a long moment where neither of them spoke. "You're early," he said finally. "By 2 days." She kept her voice level. "The coach schedule changed. I sent a letter." "Didn't get it." "I know." He looked past her at the kitchen, taking in the clean dishes stacked by the dry sink, the swept floor, the pot still on the stove. Some calculation happened behind his eyes. "The boys eat?" he asked. "Yes." "Micah give you trouble?" "No. He was trying to make soup when I arrived. I finished it." Something moved briefly across Gideon's expression. Not quite emotion, but adjacent to it. "He does that," he said. "Since his..." He stopped. "He likes to cook." She understood the sentence he didn't finish. "He's good at it," she said. It wasn't entirely true. Micah was 4 and had nearly boiled cornmeal paste. But it was true in the way that mattered. He pays attention. Gideon looked at her directly then, for what felt like the first full second he'd actually allowed himself to. "I'm not going to apologize for the state of the house," he said. I know it's... You don't need to apologize for anything tonight, Evelyn said. We're both tired. The house is fine. The house was not fine, but she'd said what was necessary. He gave a single nod. He moved to the cabinet and got himself a cup and poured water from the pitcher on the counter and drank half of it standing right there. Then he set the cup down and turned to face her again. The agency said you have experience, he said. With ranching. My family ran cattle in Missouri until I was 18. We lost the property when I was 20. I spent the last 6 years managing a boarding house in Mill Haven. So you can cook and you can manage people, he said. Not dismissively, just cataloging. I can also keep accounts, negotiate with suppliers, identify sick cattle at 50 yards, and fix a fence post in under an hour, Evelyn said. If the situation requires. He looked at her for another moment. Room at the top of the stairs, he said. Left side, it's yours. There's a lock on it. He paused. Boys don't bother the locked rooms. House rule. All right. I'll be up at 4:30. Don't feel obligated. What time do the boys need to be fed? 6. Then I'll be up at 5, she said. He nodded once more and went upstairs. She stood alone in the kitchen in the lamplight for a while. Through the ceiling, she could hear the creak of his footsteps, and then a door closing, and then the house settling into its nighttime sounds. She picked up the cold coffee and drank it in 2 swallows. Then she went to find her room. The first week was not a disaster, which surprised her. She had expected a disaster. What she got instead was a slow, grinding battle of inches. The kind of resistance that doesn't come at you directly, but just makes everything harder by degrees. Caleb was the architect of this resistance. Not through cruelty, but through absolute methodical non-cooperation. He answered her questions with the minimum required words. He did not acknowledge her instructions as instructions, just occasionally happened to do the same things she'd suggested, on his own time, on his own terms. He kept his brothers in line, not against her exactly, but not toward her either, in a holding pattern. Thomas was more openly hostile, though only in small ways. He moved things she'd organized. He forgot, or seemed to forget, to pass messages she'd asked him to relay. Once she found her clean laundry in the dirt yard after a windstorm, and she could not be certain whether it had blown down from the line or been taken down. And that uncertainty was, she suspected, entirely intentional. Eli was her first unexpected ally, though he would have been horrified to be called that. He was 8 years old and profoundly practical, and he quickly noticed that things ran better when Evelyn was involved. He started showing up in the kitchen while she cooked, not to help, just to be there, which in the specific language of 8-year-old boys meant quite a lot. Noah spoke so quietly that for the first 4 days she thought he simply didn't talk. Then she discovered he talked constantly, just never when anyone else could hear, and usually to himself or to Micah, or eventually to her when they were in the same room and the others weren't around. He had an entire running commentary on the world that he delivered in a murmur barely above a whisper, and once she started paying attention to it, she realized he was one of the most observant people she'd ever encountered. The south fence line is going, he told her on the 5th morning while she was hanging laundry. She almost missed it. 3 posts have shifted. Pa knows, but he doesn't have time. How do you know he knows? She asked. He walked it last Tuesday, Noah said. He does that when he's worried about something, walks the perimeter. She filed this away. Samuel was 5 and lived in an emotional world that was entirely his own. He cried easily and without shame, recovered quickly, and had apparently developed an iron stomach because he ate everything she put in front of him, regardless of what it was, including the batch of slightly wrong biscuits she made on day 3 that she'd been privately mortified by. These are good, Samuel told her, eating his 3rd. They're not quite right, she said honestly. I don't care, he said. She found she genuinely liked him, and Micah had apparently decided on day 1 that she was acceptable, and he operated from this assumption with the serene confidence of someone who has made a decision and is done thinking about it. He followed her around the house. He asked questions about everything. He handed her tools when she was fixing things, sometimes the right tool and sometimes entirely the wrong one, but always with great seriousness. He fell asleep at the kitchen table twice in the first week, and she carried him to bed both times, and she told herself this meant nothing. It was just practical. It was what you did with a sleeping child. She told herself that. She learned the ranch in the mornings, before the boys were properly awake. This was her method. She needed to see everything before she could understand anything, and she did not ask permission to look because asking permission would have suggested she might not have it. She walked the pastures. She studied the fence lines. She counted the cattle and cross-checked the count against the ledger she found in Gideon's office, which was a small room off the main hall that smelled of paper and old coffee and something like exhaustion. The numbers in the ledger were not good. She wasn't a trained accountant, but she'd kept books for the boarding house for 6 years, and she understood what she was looking at. The Hart Ranch had been profitable once. She could see it in the older pages, years where the numbers climbed and the margins were solid. The decline had started about 5 years ago, which she placed against what she knew of the timeline. That was when Gideon's wife had died. He'd been running this alone since then, not running it badly. That was important. He wasn't careless or negligent, he was just outnumbered. 6 boys and 1,000 acres and mounting debt from 2 dry summers in a row, and no one to help him see around corners. The water situation worried her most. She found the old irrigation maps tucked in the back of the ledger, hand-drawn, faded at the edges, done in someone else's handwriting that was smaller and more careful than Gideon's. His wife's, she suspected, though she didn't ask. The maps showed a network of channels that had once fed the eastern fields from a seasonal creek that ran through the property's northern edge. Most of those channels were dry now, choked with years of debris and neglect. On the 8th morning, she followed the line of one such channel from the field back toward the creek bed. It was early, the sky barely light, frost on the ground that crunched under her boots. She found the blockage about a quarter-mile from the source, a collapsed section where the bank had caved in, probably in last spring's rains, and 2 seasons of debris had built up behind it. She stood there looking at it for a long time. That's been like that since April. She turned. Gideon was standing 10 feet behind her. She hadn't heard him coming. He had his hat in his hands and the collar of his coat up against the cold. "You knew about this?" she asked. "Been on my list." "A list that long is a problem." He looked at her for a moment, not offended, just measuring. "I'm aware," he said. "How many channels are blocked like this?" "4 that I know of." "How much of your eastern acreage could you recover if the irrigation was restored?" He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe 30 acres," he said. "Good soil under there if it gets water." She looked back at the blockage. It wasn't a simple repair, but it wasn't complicated either. It was just work. Hard physical work and time and some lumber for shoring. "I want to start clearing this," she said. "It's a 2-man job minimum." "I'm aware." "Caleb's strong enough to help." "Caleb's got morning chores." "I can shift his chores to afternoon," she said. "Noah can feed the chickens, Samuel can fill the water trough, Eli can do the milk." Gideon was very still. She realized with a start that she had just reorganized his household without asking. She opened her mouth to soften it, to qualify it, to offer it as a suggestion rather than a statement. Then she closed her mouth. She had studied this ranch. She knew what it needed. Offering it as a suggestion would be dishonest. "If you have objections," she said instead, "I want to hear them." He looked at her for what felt like a full minute. "No objections," he said. "Caleb did not come willingly. He came because his father told him to, which was a different thing. And for the first 2 hours of that first morning at the channel, he made his reluctance felt through the specific passive resistance available to a 12-year-old. Slow movements, minimal words, sighs that were just below the threshold of disrespect. Evelyn handed him a shovel and got to work and didn't comment on any of it. She worked hard. She didn't perform working hard. She just worked, steadily, without stopping except to drink from the canteen she'd brought. The channel debris was heavy, compacted by months of sitting, and by the end of the first hour, her shoulders were burning and she had blisters coming in on both palms. Caleb, she noticed from the corner of her eye, kept glancing at her. By the 3rd hour, something had shifted. He wasn't sighing anymore. He was working, actually working, matching her pace, and then gradually, incrementally, exceeding it. Because he was 12 and couldn't help himself, and somewhere under all that careful removal, he was competitive. At noon, she stopped and sat down on the bank and ate the bread and cheese she'd packed and didn't say anything about the work or how much they'd done. Caleb sat down a few feet away. He ate his own food. He was sweaty and had mud on his forearms, and his hair had escaped its tie on one side. After a while, he said without looking at her, The East Field used to grow sorghum. Your father told you that? Ma told me. A pause. She kept the maps. She always said if the channel got fixed, we could grow sorghum again and it would cut the feed costs in half. Evelyn looked at the partially cleared channel in front of them, at the dark soil of the bank, richer than it looked. She was right, she said, about the soil, at least. Caleb was quiet. She was right about most things, he said. It wasn't an attack, it was just a fact, delivered plainly, the way a 12-year-old boy states what he knows to be true when he's too tired to be guarded. I don't doubt it, Evelyn said. Caleb looked at her then, quickly, and then away. They went back to work. The cattle baron's man came on a Thursday. He arrived in a good coat and good boots, which immediately marked him as someone from outside the territory. He had a soft voice and a practiced smile, and he smelled of something that cost money. His name was Aldrich Pruitt, and he worked, he explained, for a Mr. Cornelius Vane of the Vane Land and Cattle Corporation. Evelyn answered the door because Gideon was out in the south pasture, and she saw no reason to lie about that. Mrs. Hart? Pruitt said, with a smile that contained several layers of assumption. Yes, she said. I have a proposal for your husband. I'll hear it, she said. The smile thinned slightly. This would really be a matter for Mr. Hart. Mr. Hart is busy, she said. I manage the household accounts, and I'm familiar with the property's finances. Whatever you have to say to him, you can say to me, and I'll convey it accurately. Pruitt reassessed her. She could see him doing it. Mr. Vane is interested in acquiring the Hart property, he said. He's prepared to offer a fair price. What price? He named it. Evelyn did not change her expression. The number was an insult. Roughly half the land's value, even in its current diminished state, less than a third of what it had been worth 7 years ago, and nothing close to what it would be worth if the water situation was corrected. I'll tell my husband you came by, she said. Mrs. Hart, Pruitt's voice shifted just slightly toward something more direct. Mr. Vane has been very patient. The Hart property has been in difficulty for several years now. He's offering a way out of a difficult situation. We'll take that under advisement, she said. Thank you for coming. She closed the door. She stood in the front hall for a moment in the quiet of the house. She could hear Micah upstairs playing some kind of game that involved irregular thumping. She could hear the faint sound of Eli and Noah arguing about something outside. She walked to the kitchen and sat down at the table. Her hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady. She thought about the 30 acres that could grow sorghum. She thought about the 4-block channels and how many they'd cleared so far. 1.5. And she thought about the ledger numbers and what 30 acres of sorghum would do to them. She thought about a cattle baron sitting somewhere comfortable, patient, waiting for a man who was exhausted and outnumbered to finally give up. She thought, not yet. Not if I can help it. Then she got up and started making supper. That night, after those boys were in bed, she told Gideon about Pruitt's visit. He was at the kitchen table, going over the ledger. He listened to her without looking up from the page, which she had learned was not dismissal. It was how he processed things. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He'll come back, Gideon said. He'll come back, she agreed. With a better argument, probably. Maybe with pressure I don't know about yet. Gideon closed the ledger. He looked at the table for a moment, and then at her. You didn't let him in, he said. No. Most women would have been flustered, invited him in for coffee, felt like they had to be polite. Being polite and being accommodating aren't the same thing, Evelyn said. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. The muscles around his eyes moved just slightly, which on Gideon Hart amounted to approximately the same thing. No, he said. I suppose they're not. He picked up his coffee cup and looked down into it. She got up and refilled it without asking, which she knew he'd noticed. The offer they made, he said. Is it close to what you'd expect? It's about half what the land is worth right now, she said. And that's at current value, with the water problem. And with the water problem corrected? She met his eyes. Different conversation entirely, she said. Gideon was very still. Outside, the wind moved through the yard, rattling the loose board on the barn she'd been meaning to note to him. How long, he said. To fix the channels. 3 weeks of work, maybe 4, if the weather turns. We'd need lumber for the shoring. I know where we can get it cheap, she said. Bill Tasker in Millhaven owes a favor to my uncle, and he's been trying to clear old stock from his yard since summer. Gideon looked at her steadily. The lamp between them threw uneven light, and she could see the lines in his face, and the gray at his temple, and the way he was holding something very carefully together behind his eyes. "Why are you doing this?" he said. The question was quiet, genuine. She thought about it honestly. "I don't have anywhere else to be," she said finally, "and this place has more life in it than people think." He was quiet for a long moment. "All right," he said. That was all. But in the economy of Gideon Hart's communication, she was beginning to understand. All right covered a great deal of ground. She washed the cups. She turned down the lamp. She went upstairs to her room, the room with the lock on it, the lock she'd stopped using after the first 4 days, and she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the iron key she'd been carrying since the day she arrived. It was a door key. She'd picked it up from the peg by the front door when she realized it was a spare, intending to make a copy and give the original back. She'd never gotten around to it. She turned it over in her fingers in the dark. Outside the window, Dry Hollow sat under a huge and indifferent sky, and somewhere on the south pasture, a coyote was making its nighttime noise. The house around her was silent in the way that houses are silent when they contain sleeping people. Not empty, just at rest. She set the key on the nightstand and lay down. She did not sleep easily, the way she never had in strange beds, but she slept. And the house held itself together through the night, same as always. Same as it had been doing for years without help, waiting for someone to notice it was worth saving. The second channel took longer than the first, partly because of the weather. A cold front moved through the territory in the third week of November, bringing gray mornings and a wind that cut through every layer Evelyn owned, and partly because the second blockage was deeper and more complicated than it had looked from the surface. What she'd thought was a simple cave-in turned out to be a collapse over nearly 12 feet, with the old stone lining of the channel fractured in 3 places. It would need shoring before it could carry water again, and the shoring would need lumber, and the lumber was in Millhaven. She wrote the letter to Bill Tasker herself. Gideon read it before she sent it, made 2 changes, both of them small, both of them correct, and handed it back without comment. The lumber arrived on a Friday, 2 weeks later than she'd hoped, loaded on a wagon driven by a skinny man named Pete, who complained about the road the entire time he was unloading it, and then complained about the return trip before he'd even finished leaving. Caleb watched him go from the porch. "He does that every time," he said. "Complains the whole visit, and then comes back anyway." "People who complain the loudest usually need the job the most," Evelyn said. Caleb looked at her sideways. It was the kind of look that meant he was filing something away. They'd been working the channel together for 3 weeks by then, and something had shifted between them. Not into warmth, exactly, but into a kind of functional respect that was its own thing. Caleb still didn't call her anything. Not by name, not ma'am, nothing. But he'd stopped arriving late to the work, and he'd stopped doing that thing where he set his tools down 1 beat slower than necessary, and twice she'd caught him explaining to Eli what they were doing and why, using the same reasoning she'd given him, which he'd delivered as if he'd come up with it himself. She let him have it. That was fine. The shoring took 4 days. She and Caleb did most of it, with Thomas joining reluctantly on the second day after Gideon said 2 words to him that Evelyn didn't catch. Thomas worked hard when he worked. She'd give him that. He had his father's physical competence, the ability to read what a task needed and apply himself to it without wasted motion. He just resented being told to do it by her. On the 4th afternoon, when they set the last piece of shoring and packed the bank dirt back in around it, Thomas straightened up and looked at what they'd done. The channel was clear now, structurally sound, ready to be connected back to the water source. He said nothing. But he didn't leave immediately either. He stood there looking at it. "Your mother drew those maps," Evelyn said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out because it was true, and because she was tired, and sometimes the truth slides out when you're tired. Thomas went very still. "I know," he said. The hand on the older sections of the ledger, the irrigation notes. That was her work. She was good with numbers. His voice was flat but not cold. "Better than Pa." "Better than most people," Evelyn said. Thomas picked up his shovel and slung it over his shoulder and walked back toward the house without another word. But his back was less rigid than it usually was. Something in the set of his shoulders was different. She watched him go and thought, inch by inch. The water came through the second channel 3 days later. They heard it before they saw it. A sound like something exhaling, a long, low rush in the pipe. And then it appeared at the field end, dark with disturbed sediment at first, then clearing. Eli, who had appointed himself official observer, let out a sound that was more like a bark than a shout. Noah, standing next to him, said very quietly, "There it goes." Even Caleb didn't bother hiding that he was pleased. Gideon was behind all of them, slightly apart the way he always positioned himself, hands in his coat pockets, watching. Evelyn glanced back at him, and he gave her a single nod. That was enough. Aldrich Pruitt came back on a Tuesday. This time he didn't come alone. He brought a man named Corbett, who said nothing and stood slightly behind Pruitt's right shoulder and whose function, Evelyn understood immediately, was to be noticed. He was large and had the kind of stillness that was not peaceful. Gideon answered the door this time. Evelyn was in the kitchen, but the house was small and the walls were thin. "Mr. Hart," Pruitt said, "I hope this isn't an inconvenient time." "It's always an inconvenient time," Gideon said. "What do you want?" A brief pause. "Mr. Vane has authorized me to increase his offer. He's prepared to be generous, given your current—" "The answer's no," Gideon said. "Mr. Hart, I think if you looked at the figures, the answer is no." Another pause. When Pruitt spoke again, his voice had shifted. The practiced warmth was still there, but something underneath it had gone harder. "I understand you've been doing some work on the property," he said. "Irrigation improvements, I'm told. That's admirable. But I'd encourage you to think carefully about the debt structure you're carrying. A bad winter, another dry summer. These things have a way of changing a man's options." The silence that followed was the specific silence of Gideon Hart deciding something. "Get off my land," he said. It was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was the voice of a man who has said a thing and means all of it. Evelyn heard Pruitt's footsteps on the porch, and then the heavier footsteps of the man called Corbett, and then the sound of a horse being turned in the yard. She went to the window and watched them go. When Gideon came into the kitchen, he went straight to the water pitcher and filled a glass and drank it in one long pull. Then he stood there with his hands on the counter, his back to her. "He knows about the irrigation work," he said. "Someone in town must have talked," she said. "Or Pruitt has been watching the property." "Probably both." He turned around. "He's right about the debt." "I know. We can do everything right and still lose this place if we hit another bad season with what we're carrying." She looked at him directly. "I know," she said again. "I've been thinking about that." "And?" "I have an idea," she said, "but I need to know more about the Tasker agreement first. And I need to see the full debt record, not just the ledger. I need to see what's been filed with the county." Gideon's expression shifted. Something cautious moved through it. "Those are private records," he said. "I'm your wife," she said. Not aggressively, just as a fact. He held her gaze for a long moment. "I'll get the box," he said. The box was a battered tin thing that lived under a loose floorboard in the office, and it contained 4 years of documents that Gideon had been mostly not looking at because looking at them hurt, and he was doing his best to simply survive each season and deal with the future when it arrived. They sat at the kitchen table after supper, the boys upstairs, and went through it together. She read, and he explained, and she asked questions, and he answered them, and occasionally one of them made a note on the paper she'd brought to the table. It was bad. Not catastrophic, not yet, but the margins were razor thin, and Pruitt was right that one bad season could tip it. 2 liens on the east pasture from a loan taken 4 years ago, back taxes on the lower 40 that had been deferred twice, a debt to a feed supplier in Hollow Creek that had been quietly accumulating interest. "You've been managing this alone," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just the shape of what she was looking at. "I've been surviving it," he said. "There's a difference." "Yes." He paused. "There is." She tapped her pencil against the paper. She thought about the east field, the cleared channel, the dark soil under there that nobody had touched in 3 years. She thought about something Noah had said quietly while she was hanging laundry. The Delaney place to the north went fallow last spring. Their well came up dry. "What do you know about the Delaney property?" she asked. Gideon looked up. "Frank Delaney? Lost his well in the spring floods. His family moved to his wife's people in Colorado. Place has been sitting empty since June. Does it border us on the north? Upper fence line, yes. About 300 yards of shared boundary. Evelyn set down her pencil. Their well came up dry, she said, but our seasonal creek runs along the north boundary line. Gideon was very still. Their soil, she said. Good soil, he said slowly. Rich. Frank always said he had the best bottomland in the valley. It was just the water that... He stopped. If someone were leasing that land, she said, and had access to water from this side of the boundary, that's a significant undertaking. I know. We don't have the capital to... We don't need capital to approach whoever holds the Delaney deed and propose a lease arrangement, she said. We need a conversation. Gideon looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked at her with an expression she hadn't quite seen on him before. It wasn't agreement, exactly. It was more like the look of someone who has been navigating by dead reckoning for a long time and has suddenly been handed a compass. You think like a rancher, he said. I was one, she said. He was quiet. I'll ride to the county office Thursday, he said. She nodded. They sat at that table for another hour, going through the rest of the documents, and the lamp burned low between them, and at some point Evelyn got up and refilled both their cups without asking, and he said thank you without looking up from the paper he was reading, and it was a small thing, but it was the first time he'd said it without being prompted by the boys, and she noticed it and said nothing and sat back down. Thomas found them like that when he came downstairs at 10 o'clock for water. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the two of them at the table with papers spread between them, and something moved across his face that was too complicated for Evelyn to read in the dim light. Go back to bed, Gideon said, without looking up. Thomas got his water and went, but he walked slower going up the stairs than he had coming down. The community around Dry Hollow operated the way small frontier communities always had, on information, most of it imprecise, traveling faster than it had any right to. By the time Gideon came back from the county office on Thursday with what he'd found about the Delaney deed, 3 separate people in town had apparently already heard that the Hart Ranch was doing something with the water, and at least one of them had decided this was worth reporting to someone connected to Cornelius Vane. Evelyn found this out from an unexpected source. She was at Danner's General Store on Friday morning, picking up salt and a new sharpening stone, when a woman came in behind her and said, in the direct way of someone who has decided to say a thing before she loses her nerve, "You're the Hart woman." Evelyn turned. The woman was about 60, short, built solid, with white hair pulled back severely, and the kind of face that had been carved by decades of sun and wind. She was wearing a good wool coat, and she carried herself with the easy authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. I'm Evelyn Hart, Evelyn said. Ruth Alderman. My late husband ran the Alderman property 10 miles east. I run it now. She crossed her arms. I heard about Pruitt's visits. Word travels. Word always travels, Ruth said. I also heard you turned him away twice. My husband turned him away. I just had the door. Something in Ruth's expression shifted. She studied Evelyn with frank assessment for a moment. Vane's been buying up land in this valley for 3 years, Ruth said. He got the Pritchard place in the spring. The Hollowell brothers sold last fall. They didn't want to, but he found their weak point. A pause. He's patient. That's the thing about men with that kind of money. They can afford to be patient. I know, Evelyn said. Do you know why he wants the Hart property specifically? Evelyn waited. Grazing rights, Ruth said. There's an old territorial grant that covers the Central Valley corridor. Whoever holds the Heartland controls access to about 40% of the open range in this section. Vane gets that. He can set the terms for every rancher who wants to move cattle through the valley. Evelyn stood very still. She thought about the documents in that tin box. She hadn't seen anything about a territorial grant, but that kind of thing might not be in a household ledger. It might be in county records, in old deeds, in documents filed before Gideon had any reason to look for them. Does Gideon know this? She said. I don't know what Gideon knows, Ruth said. I know he's been keeping his head down and trying to hold on, same as the rest of us, and men doing that don't always look up far enough to see what's actually coming at them. She said it without cruelty. It was just a true thing. Thank you, Evelyn said. Ruth nodded once. She picked up her own items from the counter and paid for them and walked out. At the door she paused. My late husband always said the Heartland was the keystone of this valley. she said. Lose the keystone, the whole arch comes down. She looked at Evelyn steadily. Don't lose it. Then she was gone. Evelyn paid for her salt and her sharpening stone and walked back to the ranch in the cold morning air, and she turned over everything Ruth Alderman had said, and by the time she reached the front gate, she had understood several things she hadn't understood before. She told Gideon that evening. He took it the way he took most hard information, in silence, with a stillness that was not passivity, but absorption. He sat at the kitchen table while she talked, and when she was done, he was quiet for nearly a full minute. A territorial grazing grant, he said. I think that's why the offer is as low as it is, she said. If he told you what he was actually buying, you'd know what it was worth. That's fraud. It's concealment. Whether it crosses into fraud depends on how the documents are worded. Gideon's jaw tightened. I need to find that grant. So do I, she said, because if it exists and it's attached to this land, that changes what we can do with it. We're not just protecting a struggling ranch. We're protecting something that has value to every rancher in this valley. He looked at her across the table. That changes the conversation with the neighbors, he said. Significantly, she said. People fight harder for something when they understand what's actually at stake. It was the most she'd ever seen Gideon think in real time. She could see it happening, the pieces moving, the implications connecting. He was not a man who processed things quickly on the surface, but she was beginning to understand that the depth of it was real, and that once he'd worked something through, his resolve was absolute. I'll need to go back to the county office, he said. The old records, not just the recent ones. Some of those territorial grants were filed decades ago. Take the week if you need to, she said. I can manage here. He glanced at her, and the corner of his mouth moved. I know you can, he said. There were complications that week that had nothing to do with land grants or cattle barons. Samuel fell out of the big oak by the barn and broke 2 fingers on his left hand. Evelyn splinted them herself, having learned how from her father and never expected to need it, while Samuel cried with the uninhibited fullness of a 5-year-old and then abruptly stopped crying the moment it was done and asked for bread with honey as if the whole incident had been someone else's problem. Noah had a nightmare 2 nights running that was bad enough that she heard him from across the hall, and on the second night she went in and sat with him in the dark and didn't ask him what it was about because she could tell he didn't want to say. He curled against the pillow with his eyes open, and she sat on the edge of his bed, and after a while he said very quietly, She used to do this. She knew who he meant. I know, she said, not pretending to be the same person, just acknowledging what he'd said. He was quiet for a while, and then he went back to sleep, and she went back to her own room and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and let herself feel, briefly, the weight of what this was. Not a household to be managed, but a family of broken people trying to stay standing, and herself among them, also broken in her own ways that she hadn't fully accounted for when she'd signed the papers in Millhaven. She told Gideon she didn't have anywhere else to be. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that she'd spent 6 years running other people's house and feeding other people's guests and keeping accounts for a life that wasn't hers. And she had arrived at 26 with competence and practicality and no clear sense of what she was actually for. The agency arrangement had seemed like a practical solution to a practical problem, and she'd told herself that was enough. Sitting in the dark of a frontier house with the sound of a 7-year-old steady breathing through the wall, she thought, maybe I was wrong about what enough looks like. Not resolution. She wasn't given to resolution in the dark, just an observation, a true thing she had noticed. Gideon came back from the county office on Friday with a rolled document under his arm and an expression that was difficult to read because he was working hard to keep it level. He spread the document on the kitchen table. She looked at it. Old paper, brown at the edges, the text in the formal language of territorial law from 40 years back. Granted to the holder of the Hart property and its successors in perpetuity the right of passage and grazing across the central corridor of the Dry Hollow Valley. She read the whole thing. Then she read it again. It's real, she said. It's real, he said. Vane knows this exists. Has to, Gideon said. No way his people did due diligence on this valley without finding it. She straightened up from the table. He wasn't trying to buy land, she said. He was trying to buy control of this entire valley. Gideon nodded. His hands were flat on the table beside the document. She could see the knuckles. "So what do we do?" he said. She looked at the document. She thought about Ruth Alderman and the Pritchard place and the Hollowell brothers who hadn't wanted to sell. She thought about Caleb working the channel in the cold. She thought about the East Field, dark and waiting, with water finally coming through it for the first time in 3 years. She thought about the fact that the people in this valley had been losing one by one because they'd each been fighting alone. "We stopped fighting this alone," she said. Gideon looked at her. "Alderman," she said, "and whoever else is left that Vane hasn't gotten to yet. We show them this document. We show them what he was actually buying, and we propose something together." "That's a hard conversation to start," Gideon said. "People around here don't come together easy. They're proud, independent." "I know," she said. "But proud and independent people can be reasoned with when you show them that the alternative is losing everything they're proud of." He was quiet. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the kitchen window in its frame. She'd been meaning to recaulk that window for 2 weeks. "You'd have to be the one to do most of the talking," he said. "I know that too." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite admiration, but lived somewhere in the neighborhood of both. "All right," he said. That night at supper, something was different. She couldn't have named exactly what. The boys were the same as always, Micah talking too much, Samuel eating too fast, Eli and Noah having a disagreement about something involving the barn cat, Thomas quiet, Caleb observant. The food was the same. The table was the same. But Gideon, who almost never spoke at supper, said, in the middle of it, "We're keeping the ranch." No preamble. No explanation of what had led to it. The table went still. "Pa," Caleb said carefully. "The Vane man. We're keeping it," Gideon said. He wasn't loud. He was never loud. But every person at that table heard the thing underneath it, the thing that had been present but unspoken for years. "I have not given up." Micah looked from his father to Evelyn with the direct gaze of a 4-year-old and said, "Because Evelyn fixed the water?" The table held its breath. Evelyn looked at her plate. "That's part of it," Gideon said. Micah nodded, satisfied, and went back to his food. Thomas, across the table, was looking at Evelyn with an expression she'd never seen on him before. She met his eyes briefly. He looked away first. That night, long after the house had gone quiet and the lamp was out in the kitchen, she heard footsteps stop outside her door. A pause. Then they went away. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and did not know what to make of it, and told herself she didn't need to make anything of it, not yet. But she lay there listening to the house for a long time before she slept. The meeting with the Valley Ranchers happened on a Saturday, which was the only day most of them could leave their properties without something falling apart in their absence. Evelyn had written 7 letters. 4 came back with a yes. 1 came back with a polite no that read like a frightened no, which she understood. If Vane had already gotten to them, agreement was a risk they couldn't afford. 1 came back with no response at all. And Ruth Alderman's came back the same afternoon it was sent, with a single line in Ruth's sharp handwriting. "About time. I'll bring coffee." The meeting was at the Hart Ranch because it was central, and because Evelyn had suggested neutral ground and Gideon had said quietly that he thought it was time to stop being ashamed of the state of the place. She'd cleaned the house properly the 2 days before. Not to impress, but because people make decisions differently in rooms that feel cared for versus rooms that feel abandoned. She knew this from 6 years of running a boarding house, where the quality of a conversation over a meal could depend entirely on whether the tablecloth was clean. She also baked. Not because she was trying to perform domesticity, but because her hands needed something to do when she was anxious, and pie crust was the right kind of work for that. Methodical, requiring attention, punishing of distraction. Thomas found her in the kitchen at 5 in the morning on the Saturday and stopped in the doorway. "That's a lot of pie," he said. "3, she said. "Apple and 2 dried cherry." He was quiet for a moment. Then he came in and sat at the table. "Pa says these ranchers are the ones who didn't sell to Vane." "The ones who haven't sold yet," she corrected. "There's a difference." Thomas picked at the edge of the table, a habit she'd noticed when he was thinking. "What do you need them to do?" he asked. "I need them to understand that the grazing grant affects all of them, and I need them to agree to file a joint statement with the county clerk before Vane can move on any of the remaining properties. What does a joint statement do? It puts the grant on public record as contested land, she said. It makes it harder for Vane to acquire it quietly. Harder doesn't mean impossible, but it buys time, and time is what we need. Thomas absorbed this. Caleb thinks you know what you're doing, he said. He made it sound like he was delivering information, not a compliment. What do you think? She said. He looked at the table. I think you work harder than I expected. That was Thomas Hart at 10 years old, offering the closest thing to approval he knew how to give, and Evelyn received it for exactly what it was. Thank you, she said simply, and went back to her crust. The 4 ranchers arrived between 9 and 10 that morning. Ruth Alderman came first. In a wagon she drove herself, with a large pot of coffee wrapped in a blanket and the settled bearing of someone who has attended many difficult meetings and finds them preferable to the alternative. Behind her came the Mayhew brothers, Dell and Carson, who ran a cattle operation 12 miles southwest, and had the particular dynamic of siblings who had worked together so long they'd stopped needing to finish each other's sentences. Last came a man named Hector Reyes, who ran sheep on the eastern slope and whom Evelyn had never met, but who shook her hand with the directness of someone who respects their own time and expects others to as well. Gideon met them in the yard. He was not comfortable hosting. She could see it in the way he stood, the slight rigidity in his shoulders. But he shook hands and said the right things and brought them inside, and Evelyn had the coffee poured and the pie cut before anyone had time to be uncomfortable about the patched porch or the burlap window. The boys had been sent to the barn with instructions from Gideon that were brief and final. Micah had protested briefly and then accepted a piece of pie and gone without further argument, which was either a sign of his good nature or evidence that pie was a more effective diplomatic tool than anyone gave it credit for. She spread the territorial grant on the kitchen table. She let them read it. She gave them time because that was important. People who feel rushed into understanding something will resist it even when it's clear. Ruth had seen it already. She stood with her coffee and watched the others read and said nothing. Del Mayhew read faster than his brother. He sat back when he was done. How long have you had this? He asked Gideon. Found it last week, Gideon said. My wife found the trail to it. Del looked at Evelyn. She held his gaze. Vane knows about this grant? He said. He has to, she said. His men have been working this valley for 2 years. No competent land agent misses a territorial grant this size. So he's been making lowball offers knowing full well what this land is actually worth. He's been buying control of the valley corridor one property at a time, Evelyn said. The Pritchard place, the Hollowell brothers, those weren't just land purchases. They were pieces of the corridor. He gets the Hart property. He has enough of the grant territory to argue controlling interest. Carson Mayhew, who had been quiet, said, What does controlling interest mean practically? It means he sets the terms for cattle movement through the valley, Evelyn said. Every rancher who wants to move stock through the corridor either pays Vane's rates or routes around it, which adds days to any drive. For some operations, that could be the difference between profit and loss on a season. Hector Reyes had been listening with his arms crossed. He was about 50, with a weathered face and dark eyes that moved carefully between people when they talked. Why come to us? He said. If the grant is attached to the Heartland, it's Hart's protection, not ours. Because Vane doesn't stop at the Hart property, Evelyn said. If we don't hold this land, he keeps moving. The Mayhew property borders the southern corridor. Your eastern slope access, Mr. Reyes, runs through grazing land that shares a fence line with 2 properties Vane already owns. Ruth's operation is the only one in the valley that doesn't have a vulnerability, and that's only because her terrain isn't worth what the rest of ours is. Ruth, over her coffee, said mildly, She's right. What we're asking, Evelyn continued, is for each of you to co-sign a filing with the county clerk that puts this grant on public record as a contested and active territorial right. It doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't obligate you to anything beyond your signature. But it creates a legal record that makes any transfer of the Heartland complicated enough that Vane has to fight it openly instead of quietly. Del Mayhew leaned forward. And if he fights it openly? Then it becomes a public matter, she said, and the Territorial Land Office has jurisdiction over grants of this age. That's a different kind of fight than a land purchase negotiation. The room was quiet for a moment. The fire in the kitchen stove ticked. You've thought about this some, Del said. "I've thought about it a great deal," she said. It took another hour. Carson had questions about the filing process. Hector wanted to know what recourse they had if Vane retaliated through the feed and supply networks he had influence over. Ruth asked two questions that cut straight to the structural heart of the proposal and that Evelyn answered as honestly as she could, including saying "I don't know" twice, which she'd found was always better than a confident wrong answer. At the end of it, all four signed. After they left, Gideon stood in the kitchen for a moment. The table still had coffee cups and pie plates on it, and the territorial grant rolled up in the center. "You ran that well," he said. "I ran it honestly," she said. "That's not always the same thing." He looked at her. "Today it was," he said. She started clearing the plates. She would look back on that Saturday as a high point, which she should have known at the time. High points in the middle of a fight are dangerous things because they make you believe the momentum has shifted, and sometimes it has, but sometimes the thing you're fighting is just gathering itself. The November that followed was relentless, not dramatically relentless, not a series of obvious blows, just the steady, grinding pressure of a hard season. The third channel proved more difficult than the second. They hit an underground rock shelf that the old maps hadn't noted, and getting around it required rerouting a section entirely, which cost 2 weeks and most of what was left of the lumber from Tasker. The East Field, which had looked so promising in October, flooded slightly when the first proper rains came because the channel grade wasn't quite right, and the water moved too fast. They fixed it, but fixing it took time, and time was the thing they were always running short of. Gideon pushed himself too hard. She could see it, and she said so once, directly, and he said he was fine in the tone of a man who knows he isn't and has decided not to engage with the question. She didn't push it, she just made sure there was food when he came in and didn't ask him to talk when he sat quietly, which was most evenings. The feed supplier debt came due earlier than expected. There had been a clause in the arrangement she hadn't seen because she hadn't known to look for it. That cost them a significant portion of what they'd managed to save, and it set back the Delaney lease conversation by at least a month. And then the cattle baron's patience ran out. Pruitt came back a third time in the first week of December, but this time he didn't come to the door. He went to the county office in Mill Haven with a filing that Evelyn didn't know about until Ruth Alderman sent a note by Ryder. Vane is claiming Pryor right on the grazing corridor, says the grant language is ambiguous. He's filed for a ruling. Evelyn read the note twice at the kitchen table. She thought about this meeting, the 4 signatures, the document she had believed would buy them time. She thought, he moved faster than I expected. And then, more honestly, I underestimated him. Gideon read the note standing up, which was how he read bad news. "What does a prior right claim mean?" he asked. "It means he's arguing that the grant language doesn't exclusively attach to the heartland, that it could apply to any landholder in the corridor, including him, now that he holds the Pritchard and Hollowell properties. Is that argument valid?" "I don't know," she said. "I'm not a lawyer. The language is old and it's not entirely clear." She paused. "We need someone who knows territorial law. Lawyers cost money." "I know." There was a silence. "We could sell the South Quarter," Gideon said. His voice was flat, the flatness of someone naming a thing they don't want to name. Evelyn thought about the South Quarter. She'd walked it twice. Decent grazing land, not exceptional, and not part of the corridor. Selling it wouldn't compromise the grant, but it would reduce the operational capacity of the ranch significantly, and it would mean admitting, at least partially, that they were being pushed back. "How much would it get?" she said. He named a figure. It would cover a lawyer and give them a small cushion. "Who would buy it?" she said. "Without it going through Vane's network?" "Ruth Alderman might. She's been looking at expanding her East Range." Evelyn sat very still with the note in her hands. She did not want to sell the South Quarter. Not because of the land specifically, but because she had an instinct. She'd had it since the meeting, since she'd seen the signatures on the filing, that they were close to something, that the ground was shifting in their direction, and that pulling back now would be the kind of decision that looked prudent in December and looked catastrophic in March. But they needed a lawyer and they didn't have the money, and that was a simple material fact. "Talk to Ruth," she said. He nodded and went to get his coat. That night she found Caleb in the barn, which was where he went when he needed to not be in the house. He was sitting on a hay bale with a piece of tack he'd been mending, though he'd stopped mending it and was just holding it. She sat down on the hay bale across from him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The barn was cold, but the horses generated warmth, and it smelled of hay and animals, and the specific peace that barns hold, even when everything outside them is difficult. "You heard about the filing," she said. It wasn't a question. "Pa told me." He looked at the tack in his hands. "Is he going to win?" Vain. "I don't know," she said. He looked up at her. He didn't like that answer, but she saw him accept it. "Ma used to say that when you didn't know something, you should find the person who did," he said. She was right. "Do you know who that is? The person who knows this?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm working on finding out," she said. Caleb was quiet. "We worked on that channel for 3 weeks," he said, "in the cold." "I know." It felt like it meant something. She looked at him, this 12-year-old boy who had pointed a rifle at her chest on the first day and who had given her months of careful, grudging, real effort, and who was sitting in a cold barn holding a piece of tack and asking if it had meant anything. "It did mean something," she said. "The water's running. The field exists. Nobody can unfarm that land by filing a piece of paper in Millhaven." He looked at the barn floor. "But we could still lose the place," he said. "Yes," she said. "We could." He was silent for a long time. "Okay," he said finally. "Just that." "Okay." The word of someone who has looked at a hard thing directly and decided to keep standing in front of it. She went back to the house. The storm came on a Thursday night in the second week of December, 3 days before Ruth Alderman was supposed to arrive to discuss the South Quarter sale, and it came fast and hard in the way that the worst storms do, not announced properly, the sky going wrong colors in the afternoon, and the temperature dropping 20 degrees in 2 hours, and the wind starting low and building. By 8 in the evening, it was a full winter storm. Not the worst Evelyn had seen, but close to it, with sleet driving sideways and the temperature well below freezing. She could hear the barn from the house, the horses moving, something banging that she was fairly sure was the loose board she'd never gotten around to telling Gideon about. She was in the kitchen when Gideon came in from checking the south pasture, ice on his hat brim, his face set. "3 cows are down near the east fence," he said. "I got one up. 2 won't move." "How bad?" "Bad enough." "And the east channel?" "The new grade section." He stopped. She understood immediately. The channel section they'd regraded after the flooding, the one they'd been carefully managing the water flow through. If the storm overwhelmed it, if debris blocked the outflow before morning, "It'll back up into the field," she said. "Yes." "Undo 3 weeks of work." "Yes." He was already turning. "I need to go back out." "Not alone," she said. "Evelyn?" "Caleb can come," she said. "And Thomas. I'll take the east channel. You take the cattle." She said it fast and clean, the way you say things when there isn't time to have a conversation about them. Gideon looked at her for half a second. Then, "Get your coat." She got her coat. She woke Caleb and Thomas with her hand on each of their shoulders. No light needed, just her voice saying storm, east channel, get dressed. They were up and pulling on boots before she'd finished the sentence, and she thought, they've done this before. They know what a storm means. She didn't have to explain the urgency. It was already in them. Outside, the sleet hit like gravel. The lantern she carried fought the wind and mostly lost, giving her about 3 feet of visibility in any direction. She could hear Thomas behind her, breathing hard, and Caleb just ahead, already reading the terrain from memory the way someone does when they've walked ground their whole life. The east channel was 200 yards from the house, which was not far in daylight, and was a different kind of distance entirely in a December storm in the dark. She found it by following the fence line, one hand on the cold wire, and when she got to it, she could already hear the problem. Water moving faster than it should. The sound of it changed from its usual steady flow to something urgent and irregular. The outflow grate was partially blocked. Debris from the storm, dead grass, a section of broken fence rail she didn't know where it had come from, loose soil from the bank, had packed against it in the hour since Gideon had last checked. "I need to clear the grate," she said. To no one in particular, to both of them. "The bank's slick," Caleb said, from just behind her. "I know." "You'll need someone to hold the lantern and someone to hold on to you." He was right. She needed both hands to work the grate, and the bank was steep and wet. Thomas took the lantern. Caleb grabbed the back of her coat without being asked. She got down on her knees at the bank edge and reached into the freezing water and started pulling debris off the grate, piece by piece, her hands going numb within 30 seconds. The cold, a specific kind of pain that starts sharp and becomes thick. "There's more on the left side," Thomas said from above her. He'd moved the lantern, angling it so she could see what she was doing. She reached left, found a packed section of wet grass and pulled it free. The water sound changed. The blockage was clearing. "Keep going," Caleb said. He hadn't let go of her coat. She worked. She couldn't feel her hands properly by the time the grate was clear, but the water was flowing right again. The sound settling back into its proper rhythm, and she sat back on her heels and breathed. "Okay," she said. Caleb pulled her back up the bank by her coat. She got her feet under her on the solid ground and stood there for a moment with sleet hitting her face and her hands completely useless from cold and thought. It held. The field had held. The water would drain properly. All those weeks of work, the channel, the shoring, the grade correction, had been tested and had held. Thomas was standing 3 feet away, still holding the lantern. She looked at him. In the terrible light of a storm lantern in a sleet storm, she could see that he was cold and wet, and that his expression had done something she hadn't seen it do before. He looked young. For the first time, he just looked like a 10-year-old boy standing in a storm who had held the lantern steady because someone needed him to. "Thank you," she said. She meant it completely. He nodded. He didn't look away. They walked back to the house, the 3 of them, close together against the wind because the cold made proximity practical. In the kitchen, Evelyn's hands thawed enough to be painful under hot water, and she made them all drink something warm, and nobody said anything about what they'd just done because the Hart family was not given to speeches about things. And she was learning that some of the most important moments in a family's life pass without comment and are real anyway. Gideon came in an hour later. He'd gotten the cattle up. He was soaked through and he moved like someone whose back was giving him serious trouble, which she'd suspected for weeks and hadn't been able to get him to admit. He looked at the 3 of them at the kitchen table. "Channel?" he said. "Clear?" she said. "Field's fine." He looked at Caleb, at Thomas. Something happened in his face. He sat down at the table and didn't say anything for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was lower than usual. "You both did good tonight," he said. Thomas stared at his cup. His jaw moved. "Evelyn got the grate," Caleb said. "She was in the water the whole time." Gideon looked at her. She looked back. "Your hands," he said. "They're fine," she said. They were not entirely fine. The knuckles were scraped raw, and the cold had done something to the joints that would make itself felt in the morning. "They're fine," she said again. He held her gaze for a moment longer than he usually allowed himself. Then he got up and went to the cabinet and got the small bottle of whiskey he kept for medical purposes and poured a measure into her coffee cup without asking. She didn't protest. He poured one for himself and sat back down, and they all sat there in the kitchen while the storm threw itself against the house, and the house, same as always, held. When the boys finally went up to bed, exhausted and warm, Evelyn sat alone at the table for a while. She was tired in a way that went past her body. The kind of tired that is also something else, something she didn't have a clean name for. The territorial filing, the lawyer they needed and couldn't quite afford, the South Quarter sale she didn't want to make, Vane's prior right claim sitting in the county office like a slow-burning thing, and here, on the other side of the ledger, a clear channel, a field that had held, 2 boys who had come out in a storm and done what was needed. She thought about what Caleb had said in the barn. It felt like it meant something. She thought about how hard it was to hold on to that feeling when the thing you were fighting didn't stop just because you were tired. The storm was still going outside. She could hear it working at the windows, but the house was warm and the fire was low and the people in it were sleeping. She picked up her cold coffee and finished it. Then she went upstairs to figure out how to fight what was coming next. The morning after the storm, Dry Hollow looked like something that had been shaken and set back down slightly wrong. Fence rails across the valley lay flat in the mud. 2 of the Mayhew brothers' cattle had wandered through a broken section of boundary line and ended up on the road. The oak by the Hart barn had lost a major limb that now lay across the yard like something that had given up. Evelyn was outside before the boys were awake, assessing. She walked the east field first. The channel had held. She could see that clearly in the gray morning light, and the grade section they'd repaired was intact, the water moving through it at the right speed. She stood there for a moment, just looking at it, feeling the particular relief of something that had been tested and had not broken. Then she walked the rest of the property and made a list in her head, because writing in the cold with scraped hands was difficult. The south fence needed 3 new posts minimum. A section of the barn roof had lifted and would need to be secured before the next rain. 2 of the younger calves had huddled under the wrong shelter and would need watching. The damage was real, but it was manageable. That was the honest assessment. What was less manageable was what she found when she came back to the kitchen and found Gideon already up, sitting at the table with a letter in front of him that had apparently been delivered by a rider before she'd woken. He was looking at it the way he looked at things he didn't want to look at. "From the county," he said when she came in. She sat down across from him. He pushed it toward her. The ruling on Vane's prior right claim had been scheduled. A hearing at the county seat in Mill Haven, 3 weeks out, before a land commissioner named Aldous Farrell. Both parties were required to present documentation supporting their interpretation of the territorial grant. 3 weeks. She read the letter twice. "Farrell," she said. "Do you know him?" "By reputation," Gideon said. "He's been commissioner 8 years. People say he's fair, but he's also practical. He rules with whoever has the stronger documentation." "Then we need stronger documentation. We need a lawyer, Evelyn." "I know." She set the letter down. "Has Ruth responded about the South Quarter?" "She'll come Tuesday." "Good." She paused. "I want to look at the grant language again, and I want to find the original survey maps from when the grant was filed. If the territorial surveyor drew boundary lines at the time, those maps would clarify the language in a way that's hard to argue with." Gideon looked at her. "Those maps would be in the territorial archives," he said, "not the county office. The archives are in the capital." "I know. That's 4 days' travel." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "I can't go," he said. "Not right now. The property needs—" "I wasn't suggesting you go," she said. The silence that followed was careful. "Evelyn," he said, "that's a significant journey for a woman alone." She met his eyes. "I've made significant journeys alone before," she said. "That's how I got here." He held her gaze. She could see him working through it, the instinct to protect against the practical reality that she was right, that someone needed to go, and she was better equipped for the argument at the archives than he was, because she knew what she was looking for, and he didn't, not in the same way. "I don't like it," he said. "I'm not asking you to like it," she said. "I'm asking you to trust that I can do it." Another silence. "You'd need to be back within 2 weeks," he said, "to prepare for the hearing." "I'll be back in 10 days, she said. He looked at the letter on the table. He looked at her. "Take the bay mare," he said. "She's steadier than the roan in bad weather." That was his answer. She was packed and gone by 7 the following morning. Gideon was in the yard when she rode out. He didn't say much. He handed her the saddlebag he'd packed himself without telling her he was going to, which contained food for 3 days and a spare box of matches and a small folding knife she recognized as the one he kept in his coat pocket. She looked at the bag and then at him. "In case," he said. She nodded and rode. She didn't let herself look back until the road curved at the far end of the property, and when she did, he was still standing in the yard watching her go, his hands at his sides getting smaller as the distance grew. She turned back to the road. The capital was not glamorous. It was larger than Mill Haven and smaller than she'd expected, with wide dirt streets that became mud avenues when the weather was wrong, and a collection of official buildings near the center of town that looked permanent and important in the way that territorial governments wanted to look permanent and important. She arrived on the evening of the 3rd day, cold and saddle-sore, in a way she was too tired to properly feel, and found a boarding house near the main street run by a woman who charged fair rates and asked no questions, which was exactly what she needed. The territorial archives were in a stone building behind the land commissioner's office, administered by a clerk named Mr. Bodine, who was about 60, precise in the particular way of people who have spent decades handling documents other people didn't value until they suddenly needed them desperately. She explained what she was looking for. He looked at her over his glasses for a moment with the professional skepticism of a man who had seen many people come in knowing what they wanted and discover they didn't know how to ask for it. The original survey maps from a territorial grant of that age, he said. Those would be in the pre-statehood files. Do you have the grant number? She had it. She'd copied it from the document before she left. Something shifted in Bodine's expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of professional respect for someone who had done the minimum required preparation. This way, he said. The pre-statehood files were in a back room that smelled of old paper and cold stone, and they were organized in a system that made sense once Bodine explained it, and would have been impenetrable without him. He found the file in 20 minutes, which she suspected was faster than usual because he was quietly interested, in the way that archivists get interested when someone comes in with a real question rather than a vague one. The survey map was large, hand-drawn on heavy paper that had browned but not deteriorated, the lines still clear. The surveyor, a man named Calder, according to the notation at the bottom, had drawn the grant boundaries in ink that had faded to brown, with handwritten notations at each boundary point. She studied it for a long time. Then she found what she'd been hoping might be there. The boundary notation at the northern corridor, the section that Vane's filing claimed was ambiguous, was not ambiguous on the original survey. Calder had written, in his small, precise hand, a notation that cross-referenced a natural landmark to the stone formation known locally as Hart's Rock, the eastern boundary of the Hart family holding, Hart's Rock. She'd seen it. She'd walked past it twice without understanding what it was. A natural limestone formation on the eastern edge of the property, distinctive enough to use as a landmark and specific enough that it could not be the Pritchard land or the Hollowell land or anything Vane had purchased. It was on the Hart property, specifically and unambiguously, and the surveyor's notation made the grant boundary explicit in a way the grant language alone didn't. She stood very still in that cold archive room. "Mr. Bodine," she said, "I need a certified copy of this map." He looked at where she was pointing. "That'll take until tomorrow morning," he said. "That's fine," she said. "I'll wait." She spent the evening in her boarding house room going over everything she had. The grant, the survey notation, the joint filing from the Valley Ranchers, the timeline of Vane's purchases. She wrote it all out longhand, in order, the way she used to organize the boarding house accounts, because seeing things in sequence made the gaps visible. The gap she found was the one she'd been worried about. She had documentation, she had a strong argument, but Vane had money and lawyers and 8 years of land commissioner decisions to know how these hearings ran. Walking in with historical documents and a compelling interpretation was not the same as walking in prepared for what his lawyers would do to that interpretation. She needed to know Vane's filing, not just that it existed, what it said specifically, what precedents it cited, what version of the grant language it relied on. She had no way to get that document. Not legitimately, not in 10 days. She lay awake for a while thinking about this. In the morning, she collected Bodine's certified copy of the survey map, paid the fee, and was saddling the bay mare outside the archive building when a man spoke to her from behind. "You're Hart's wife." She turned. He was about 40, with a neat dark coat and a lawyer's bearing. The kind of straight-backed precision that came from years in front of commissioners and judges. She didn't know him. "I am," she said carefully. "My name is Everett Crane," he said. "I practice territorial law. I represented the Hollowell brothers when they filed against Vane's first approach." A pause. "They lost." She waited. "I know what Vane's filing says," Crane said, "because his lawyers used the same structure against the Hollowells, and I've had 18 months to think about where it's weak." She looked at him steadily. "Why are you talking to me?" she said. "Because the Hollowells lost, but the argument wasn't wrong," he said. "The documentation was incomplete. I've been watching Vane work this valley for 2 years, Mrs. Hart, and I believe what you found in that archive this morning is the piece that was missing." He paused. "I'd like to help you use it correctly." "We don't have much money," she said. "It came out plain because there wasn't time for anything else." "I'm aware," he said. "Ruth Alderman wrote to me last week. She said if you came to the Capitol alone looking for survey maps, I should find you." A brief, dry, almost smile. "She said you'd be too proud to ask for help, so she was asking for you." Evelyn stood very still in the cold morning air outside the archives. She thought about Ruth Alderman's note, the single line, "About time. I'll bring coffee." She thought about a 60-year-old woman in a good wool coat who had been watching this valley get eaten alive for 2 years and had been waiting for someone to fight back with more than pride. "What are your terms?" she said. "I work for a percentage of the land value if you win," Crane said. "Nothing if you lose." "That's a risk for you." "Yes," he said simply. "I'm aware." She looked at him for a moment. "Tell me what's weak in his filing," she said. They stood outside the archives for over an hour. He talked, and she listened with the focused attention she'd given to everything in the last 3 months that mattered. Not just hearing, but filing, cross-referencing, understanding how each piece connected to the others. He knew Vane's argument better than she'd hoped. He also knew its vulnerabilities better than she'd expected. The weakness was in the precedent Vane's lawyers had cited. They'd used a territorial ruling from 12 years prior that had established shared corridor rights under an ambiguous grant, but that ruling had been based on a grant with no original survey notation. The Hart grant had a survey notation. Calder's reference to Hart's Rock was exactly the kind of specific boundary evidence that distinguished this case from the precedent Vane was relying on. "If we can establish that Calder's notation is binding," Crane said, "their precedent doesn't apply. And if their precedent doesn't apply, the commissioner has to rule on the grant language alone, which is not ambiguous once you read it alongside the survey. Can we establish that the notation is binding?" "There's a territorial statute from 40 years ago that addresses surveyor notations in contested grants," he said. "I've read it. It's favorable. It won't be simple. Vane's lawyers will argue the notation is informal. But it's arguable, and with the certified copy you just obtained, it's arguable on the record." She looked at the saddlebag on the bay mare, where the certified copy was carefully rolled in oilskin. "All right," she said. "You're in." She rode back to Dry Hollow in 8 days instead of 10, pushing harder than was comfortable, arriving in the yard on a late afternoon when the light was going gold and flat across the dead winter grass. Gideon was at the barn when she came through the gate. He turned at the sound of hooves and watched her ride in, and she could see, even from a distance, the particular quality of stillness in him that meant he'd been worried and was now working to not show that he'd been worried. She dismounted. "Well," he said. "I found the survey map," she said, "and I found a lawyer." She watched the controlled expression on his face do something complicated. "How?" he said. "Ruth Alderman," she said. "Apparently she's been operating 3 moves ahead of all of us." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then something moved in his face that was as close to relief as she'd seen him get. A slight loosening around the jaw. The eyes doing something that wasn't quite softened but was adjacent. "Come inside," he said. "You look half frozen." She was. She handed him the mare's reins, and he took them without being asked, and she walked toward the house. The front door opened before she reached it. Micah was in the doorway, having apparently stationed himself there at some point. "You came back," he said. "I said I would," she said. He considered this. "Eli said maybe you wouldn't," he said. Then, with the honesty of a 4-year-old, "I said you would." She looked at him, small and solid in the doorway of a house that was worn and cold, and hers in every way that mattered. "You were right," she said. She stepped past him into the warmth. The following 2 weeks were the hardest kind of work. Not physical, which she was used to, but the sustained mental work of preparation under pressure. Crane arrived 3 days after she got back, made the journey from the capital on his own initiative, and set up at the kitchen table with his files and his territorial statutes. And the Hart kitchen became something between a law office and a war room in the days before the hearing. The boys adjusted to this with varying degrees of grace. Micah was fascinated by Crane and followed him around asking questions Crane handled with more patience than she'd expected from a territorial lawyer. Samuel knocked over Crane's inkwell on day 2 and cried so comprehensively about it that Crane, caught off guard, spent 10 minutes reassuring a 5-year-old that it was genuinely all right while Evelyn cleaned up the ink and didn't let herself laugh. Noah, who saw everything, told her quietly one evening, "He's nervous about the hearing." "Crane," she said. "He hides it," Noah said. "But he drinks a lot of coffee when he's nervous, and he's been drinking a lot of coffee." She found Crane alone in the kitchen the next morning with his 3rd cup before 7 and sat down across from him. "Tell me what worries you," she said. He looked at her over the cup. "Farrell," he said. "He's fair, but fair doesn't mean predictable. and Vane's people will bring their full weight to this hearing. What does their full weight look like? 3 lawyers, probably. Extensive documentation, possibly testimony from the Hollowell sale. They may try to argue the prior sale established a corridor precedent even without the Grant ruling. She thought about this. Can they do that? Use the Hollowell sale as precedent? They can try, he said. It's a stretch, but stretches work when the other side isn't prepared to counter them. Then we prepare to counter it, she said. What do we need? Documentation of continuous Hart family use of the corridor, he said, going back as far as possible. Letters, receipts, cattle drive records, anything that establishes the Hart family exercised those rights actively, not just on paper. She looked at him for a moment. Then she got up and went to Gideon's office and stood in front of the shelf where the old records sat. Not the tin box, which she'd already gone through, but the older papers, the ones in the back that were dusty and had never been touched because they predated Gideon's management of the ranch by decades. She pulled them all down. She sat on the floor of that small office and went through everything. Cattle drive records from 20 years back in Gideon's father's handwriting, receipts from suppliers in towns that no longer existed, a series of letters between the original Hart settler and a neighboring rancher that referenced the corridor passage explicitly, in plain language, describing where they drove their cattle and what route they used. 22 years of documented corridor use. All of it in the Hart family's own records, sitting in the back of a dusty shelf because no one had thought it mattered until now. She carried the stack to the kitchen table. Crane looked at it. Where was this? He said. On a shelf, she said. In the back. He picked up the top document, read the first paragraph, and set his coffee cup down. This is exactly what we needed, he said. She sat down. Is it enough? She said. He was quiet for a moment, reading. It might be, he said. Not yes. Not a promise. Just the honest assessment of a man who knew the difference between having a strong case and having a guaranteed one. She nodded. That was enough to work with. The night before the hearing, Gideon found her at the kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet. She had the documents spread before her. The survey map, the drive records, the letters, going through them one more time in the lamplight. He sat down across from her. You should sleep, he said. I will, she said. Soon. He looked at the documents. He picked up one of his father's cattle drive records and looked at it for a moment, and she could see something moving across his face that had nothing to do with the hearing, the particular expression of a person handling their family's history. He drove those cattle through the corridor every fall for 30 years, Gideon said. Never once thought it would need to be proven. Most rights don't, she said, until someone tries to take them. He set the paper down. He looked at her across the lamplight and the documents and the accumulated weeks of this, the work, the storm, the cold channel, the archive in the Capitol, all of it between them now like a shared thing that couldn't be unshared. I should have said this before, he said. She waited. What you've done for this place, he said. He stopped. Started again. I didn't know how to ask for help for a long time, and He stopped again, and she understood that this was genuinely difficult for him, that he was not a man who came to these sentences easily. You don't have to, she said. I want to, he said, the quiet firmness of it. I want to say it. She looked at him. You could have left, he said. Any number of times. Most people would have. I'm not most people, she said. No, he said. You're not. The lamp burned low between them. Outside, Dry Hollow sat cold and quiet under a winter sky. The documents on the table were 40 years of a family's claim to a piece of land, and tomorrow someone would try to take it, and they would stand up and say no with everything they had. She reached across the table and straightened the survey map, a small, unnecessary gesture, just needing to do something with her hands. Get some sleep, Gideon, she said. He sat there a moment longer, then he got up. At the kitchen doorway, he stopped. Evelyn, he said. She looked up. He didn't say anything else. He just looked at her for a moment, with everything he hadn't learned how to say yet present in his face, plain as anything. Then he went upstairs. She turned back to the documents and worked until the lamp ran low. And when she finally went to bed, she lay in the dark and listened to the house around her, all its old sounds, the creak and settle of it. 6 sleeping boys and 1 tired man and her, and thought about what it meant to fight for something you hadn't chosen but had come to need anyway. She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure there was one. She slept. The morning of the hearing, Evelyn woke before the alarm she'd set in her head. That internal clock she'd developed at the boarding house, trained by years of needing to be ready before anyone else. The sky outside her window was still dark, the particular blue-black of 5 in the morning in December, and the house was quiet in a way that felt fragile, like something that would change the moment anyone moved. She dressed carefully, not in her best dress. The gray wool was still the best she had, and she'd cleaned the axle grease from the sleeve months ago, but it had never quite looked the same after. She wore the dark blue instead, the practical one, because she was not going to the county seat to be looked at. She was going to be heard. When she came downstairs, Gideon was already in the kitchen. He had coffee made and was standing at the window with his cup, looking out at the yard in the dark. He was wearing his good coat, the one he kept for serious occasions. She poured her own coffee and stood beside him at the window without saying anything. Outside, frost on the ground caught what little light came from the kitchen, and the yard looked still and cold and somehow significant, the way ordinary places do on mornings when ordinary things are not happening. "Crane's already up," Gideon said quietly. "I know. I heard him an hour ago." A pause. "The boys know not to expect us until evening," he said. "I told Caleb last night. He'll manage." Gideon nodded. She could feel the tension in him. Not fear exactly, more the tightly controlled energy of a man who is prepared to fight and is waiting for the moment to arrive. "Whatever happens today," he said. He stopped. "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Don't start a sentence like that this morning," she said. We're going to win this. We have the better case." "Having the better case isn't always—" "I know that," she said. "But it's what we have, and it's real, and I need you to walk into that room like you know it." She looked at him directly. "Can you do that?" He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. They left at 6. The county seat at Millhaven was 40 minutes by wagon on a clear road, and the road was clear enough that morning. Cold, hard frozen from the overnight temperatures, the wagon rattling over it with a noise that made conversation difficult and thinking easy. Evelyn held the documents in the satchel on her lap and went over the structure of the argument in her head one more time, the order of presentation, the responses to the challenges Crane had anticipated. Crane sat in the back of the wagon with his briefcase across his knees, his eyes closed. Not sleeping, she thought, just conserving. They arrived at the courthouse building 20 minutes before the hearing was scheduled. Vane's people were already there. She saw them from the wagon. 3 men in good coats standing near the entrance, one of them talking to a fourth who was writing something down. They were well-dressed and unhurried in the way of people who are confident about outcomes, and she looked at them and felt something sharpen inside her that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but lived somewhere between the two and was useful either way. "Don't look at them," Crane said quietly from behind her. She looked away. Commissioner Aldous Farrell was a compact man in his 60s with a gray beard trimmed precisely, and the settled manner of someone who had presided over several hundred of these proceedings and was not moved by much. He entered the hearing room at exactly 9 o'clock, sat down, arranged his papers with 3 deliberate movements, and looked up. "We're here regarding the contested interpretation of Territorial Grant Number 447, pertaining to corridor grazing rights in the Dry Hollow Valley," he said. His voice was professionally neutral. "Counsel for the Vane Land and Cattle Corporation will present first, followed by counsel for the Hart Holding. Questions and rebuttal will follow. Let's begin." Vane's lead lawyer was a man named Aldgate. He was good. Evelyn had expected good, and he was. He had a measured, confident delivery that made everything he said sound like settled fact rather than argument, and he laid out the prior right claim with the easy competence of someone who had made this particular case before, which he essentially had, in the Hollowell hearing 18 months earlier. The precedent, the ambiguous grant language, the claim that any landholder in the corridor could invoke the grant. His documentation was impeccable, his citations precise, his manner just differential enough toward Farrell to read as respectful without being sycophantic. When he finished, Farrell made 2 notes and said, "Counsel for the Hart Holding." Crane stood. He was not as polished as Aldgate. He was thorough, which was different. and Evelyn had learned in the last 2 weeks that thoroughness and polish were different tools for different situations, and that this situation required the former. He began with the survey map. He walked Farrell through Calder's notation, the specific reference to Hart's Rock, the language that placed the corridor boundary unambiguously within the Hart property. He presented the certified copy from the Territorial Archives. He cited the 40-year-old territorial statute that addressed surveyor notations in contested grants. Then he presented the cattle drive records, 22 years of documented corridor use, Gideon's father's handwriting in ledger after ledger, the routes notated, the dates, the cattle counts, letters that named the corridor explicitly, a pattern of continuous use that was not theoretical but documented, accumulated over decades by a family that had never imagined it would need to be proven because it had simply been true. Aldgate objected twice. Farrell overruled both. Then Crane made the argument Evelyn had suggested in the kitchen 3 nights before, the one that had come to her while she was going through the old records on the office floor, the one that connected the documented use to the survey notation to the statutory provision in a single line of reasoning that didn't require the commissioner to interpret anything, just to read what was already there. When he sat down, the hearing room was quiet for a moment. Farrell looked at his notes. He looked at the certified survey map. He looked at the stack of cattle drive records. "Counsel for Vane," he said. "Your response to the surveyor notation argument." Aldgate stood. He was still composed, but she could see, she was watching carefully, that something in his preparation had not fully accounted for the Calder notation. He argued that surveyor notations were informal, non-binding, historical artifacts rather than legal instruments. Crane's rebuttal was 2 minutes long and cited the territorial statute by section number. Farrell asked 3 questions. Crane answered 2 immediately and said, "I'll refer the commission to page 4 of Exhibit 7 for the third," which he'd apparently anticipated because the page was already marked. Aldgate had no further response to that. The commissioner called a recess, 45 minutes in a cold hallway. Crane sat on a bench and drank water and didn't talk much. Gideon stood near the window and looked out at the street. Evelyn sat beside Crane and watched Vane's lawyers at the far end of the hallway having a quiet, intent conversation, and she tried to read what was happening in the way they held their bodies, and couldn't quite. "How do you think it went?" she said to Crane. "The notation argument landed," he said. Farrell asked the right questions. That means he was working through it, not dismissing it. Aldgate's response? "Weak," Crane said. "Weaker than I expected." He paused. "I think they came in assuming this was a replay of the Hollowell case. It isn't. Because of the notation." "Because of the notation," he said, "and because of the drive records. They can argue the grant language is ambiguous. They can't argue with 30 years of your father-in-law moving cattle through that corridor with no objection from anyone." She looked at the far end of the hallway where Aldgate was still talking to his colleagues, and the conversation had not relaxed, and she thought, they know. Not certainly, but enough. They knew the shape of what they were facing. Gideon came to sit beside her during the recess. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, which was its own kind of steadiness. She thought about what he'd said the night before, the sentence he hadn't finished, "What you've done for this place." She thought about the morning she'd arrived in Dry Hollow with a trunk and a marriage certificate and a heart doing something uncomfortable in her chest, and the boy with the rifle in the doorway, and Micah on his step stool with a wooden spoon bigger than his arm. She thought about how you cannot know, when you walk into a place, whether it will matter that you came. You just have to walk in anyway. Farrell came back after 40 minutes, not 45, which Crane said nothing about, but she noticed. The commissioner sat down. He arranged his papers again, the same 3 deliberate movements, and looked up. "I have reviewed the documentation presented by both parties," he said. "The central question in this proceeding is whether the territorial grant attaches exclusively to the Hart family holding, or whether its language permits a broader interpretation covering multiple corridor landholders." He paused. Not for drama. She didn't think Farrell did drama, but because what he was about to say was what he'd been building toward, and he wanted it clear. The original survey map, certified by the Territorial Archives and presented here as Exhibit 3, contains a notation by Surveyor Calder that places the eastern corridor boundary at a specific landmark identified within the Hart family property. This notation, under Territorial Statute 12, Section 4, carries binding force as a contemporaneous boundary determination made at the time of the grant's filing. He looked at his papers. The prior ruling cited by the Vane Corporation pertained to a grant without such notation. That ruling is not applicable to this proceeding. Aldgate's jaw tightened. Barely, but she saw it. Furthermore, Farrell continued, the documentation of continuous corridor use by the Hart family over a period of more than 2 decades constitutes established use under territorial law, which reinforces the exclusive nature of the grant's attachment. He set his papers down. The prior right claim filed by the Vane Land and Cattle Corporation is denied. The territorial grant number 447 attaches exclusively to the Hart family holding and its successors. This ruling is entered into the county record. He gathered his things and stood. We're adjourned, he said. The room moved. Vane's lawyers were speaking quietly among themselves. Crane was writing something in his notebook with the controlled efficiency of a man who is keeping himself very composed. Gideon sat perfectly still beside her. She sat still too, for a moment. Just sat. She had known this was the stronger case. She had believed, not blindly, but with the particular confidence of someone who has done the work and checked it twice, that they would win. But knowing something and having it happen were different, and the difference lived in the body, and hers had apparently decided to express this as a kind of stillness that she couldn't have moved out of if she'd tried. Gideon turned to look at her. His face was doing the thing it did when he felt something he didn't have the sentence for. The controlled exterior with everything visible in the eyes, if you knew how to read them, and she had learned, over 3 months, how to read them. It held, she said. It held, he said. Crane closed his notebook. He looked at both of them with the dry, measured expression of a man who had been doing this long enough to know that celebrating in a courthouse was bad form, but who was also, underneath that, clearly pleased. The ruling will be on record by end of week, he said. Vane can appeal to the territorial court, but the statute citation is airtight. It would be an expensive appeal for a result they cannot reasonably expect to change. Will he appeal? Gideon said. Men like Vane don't like losing, Crane said, but they like throwing good money after bad even less. My honest assessment is he moves on to somewhere easier. They walked out into the cold December air. Aldgate and his colleagues were already leaving, their wagon pulling out of the courthouse yard with the deliberate speed of people who are done with a place. She watched it go. Ruth Alderman was standing by the Hart wagon. She had apparently come to town, waited, and not announced herself, which was entirely consistent with everything Evelyn understood about Ruth Alderman. Well, Ruth said. We won, Evelyn said. Ruth nodded once, the nod of someone who had allowed themselves to hope for a thing and is now quietly confirming that the hope was not wasted. The grant's on record, Ruth said. Exclusively Hart land, Crane said, binding, filed today. Ruth looked at Evelyn for a moment. Good, she said. Just that. But the word carried a great deal of weight from a woman like Ruth, and Evelyn received it as it was meant. They drove home in the afternoon light, the sun low and flat and winter pale, the frozen road smoother going back than it had been in the dark morning hours. Crane fell actually asleep this time, his head against the wagon side, his briefcase still across his knees. Gideon drove. Evelyn sat beside him. For a long stretch, they didn't speak, and it wasn't the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who had too much and were letting it settle first. Then Gideon said, without looking at her, My father built that house with 3 other men in the fall of 1851. He said they worked until it was too dark to see, and then they worked by firelight. She waited. He didn't build it because he knew it would last, Gideon said. He built it because it needed to be built, and he was the one standing there. She looked at the side of his face, the lines in it, the gray at his jaw, the specific quality of his stillness that she had come to know as well as she knew the sound of the house at night. I know the feeling, she said. He glanced at her then, briefly, and in that brief glance was everything he'd been building toward saying for 3 months. Not one thing, but all of it, layered, the way people accumulate meaning in each other slowly, and then suddenly there's too much of it to name. She looked back at the road. When they came through the gate of the Hart Ranch in the late afternoon, Caleb was on the porch. He had apparently been watching the road for some time because he straightened up the moment the wagon came into view and his whole body asked the question before he did. Gideon stopped the wagon. He looked at his eldest son on the porch. "We won," he said. Caleb stood very still for a second. Then he turned and went inside, and she heard him say something, not clearly, and then the sound of the house changed. That particular change when news moves through a space full of people. The sound of children reacting, Micah's voice rising above the others asking what? Samuel making a noise that was pure, uncomplicated happiness. Eli shouting something she didn't catch. Noah appeared in the doorway behind Caleb, quiet as always, and looked at her specifically, and she gave him a single nod, and he stepped back inside without celebrating. But his face when he stepped back was not the same as when he'd stepped forward. Thomas came to the porch last. He stood there looking at them, at her, and she saw him working through something, the particular internal negotiation of a 10-year-old boy who's been angry for a long time and is trying to figure out what to do with the room that opens up when the anger no longer fits. He said, "Evelyn." It was the first time he'd used her name, not ma'am, not nothing. Her name. "Yes?" she said. He looked at his boots. "I'm glad you stayed." She looked at him for a moment. This difficult, proud, grieving boy who had moved her laundry into the dirt and given her every possible variety of 10-year-old resistance and who had held a lantern steady in a sleet storm because someone needed him to. "Me too," she said. He went back inside. The weeks that followed were not transformed. The ranch was still the ranch, still the patched porch, still the burlap window she'd replaced by then with actual glass, still the daily work that didn't stop because a hearing had gone well. The feed supplier debt still needed paying down. The Delaney lease conversation finally happened in January, and the terms were fair but not easy, and making them work required the same careful management that everything required. But things were different in the ways that mattered. The East Field got its first sorghum planting in the spring. Not a full planting, a test quarter acre, because Evelyn was not a woman who went all in on something she hadn't proven. It came up well. Better than the estimate she'd given Gideon, better than what even Caleb's mother had predicted in her notes. The feed cost projections for the following season changed significantly because of it. Word traveled the way Ruth had said it always did. The ranchers who had watched the Hart property struggling for 3 years started asking questions, not in the way they had before, with the careful distance of people watching something fail, but in the way people ask when they want to understand something that worked. Del Mayhew came out in April to look at the irrigation setup. Hector Reyes sent his son in May to learn the channel grade method. It was not a transformation. It was influence, which is quieter and lasts longer. Pruitt came one final time in February, without Corbett, without the practiced smile. He came alone and he told Gideon that Mr. Vane had decided not to appeal the territorial ruling. He said it with the neutral delivery of a man delivering a message he did not write and was not responsible for. And then he left, and they watched him go. And Gideon said nothing, and Evelyn said nothing, and the silence between them was entirely comfortable. Crane took his percentage when the spring cattle sale closed, and the numbers were better than the previous 3 years combined. He shook Evelyn's hand when he left and said, in the dry way of territorial lawyers everywhere, "You should have been an attorney." "I thought about it once," she said. He looked at her. "Still could," he said. She didn't answer that, but she thought about it sometimes, after. The iron key sat on her nightstand. She'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing things that belong in a place. And then one morning in March, she picked it up and turned it over in her hand and thought about the day she'd arrived. The dust on her boots and the grease on her sleeve and the wrong, wild uncertainty of standing in front of a broken-down house full of people who didn't want her there. She had not on that day been brave. She'd been practical, which is what people are when they have no room left for alternatives. She had rolled up her sleeves and started cooking because a 4-year-old was going to burn something and supper needed to happen, and that was the next right thing she could see. That was the whole of it, really. The whole of what she'd done and kept doing. Not a plan, not heroism, not the particular narrative of a woman who arrived and fixed everything. Just the next right thing, repeated, through months of cold and resistance and uncertainty and the slow, imperfect accumulation of trust between people who had all been broken in different ways before they found each other. She had come here not knowing what she was for. She wasn't sure she could have said now either, not in a clean sentence. But she thought about what it meant that Micah called for her first when he hurt himself, and that Noah talked to her in his quiet way about what he noticed, and that Thomas had said her name on the porch like something unlocked, and that Caleb, who had pointed a rifle at her chest on day one, had spent the whole winter working beside her in the cold and teaching his brothers what she'd taught him as if it had always been his own. She thought about what it meant that Gideon had handed her the saddlebag with the folding knife in it and the spare matches, and said in case, which was the closest he had come, for a long time, to saying come back. She was not their mother. She had never claimed to be, and she would not start now. But she was something. She had become something in this place that she didn't have a clean name for either. And maybe that was all right. Maybe not everything needed a name. Maybe some things just needed to be true. She set the key back on the nightstand. Then she went downstairs to make breakfast for 7 people, because it was morning, and that was what came next. Gideon was already in the kitchen. He had the coffee on and was looking out the window at the east field, which in the early spring light was showing the first pale green of new growth, the sorghum coming up out of dark soil that had spent 3 years waiting for water. He heard her come in and didn't turn. "It's coming up," he said. She stood beside him at the window. "It is," she said. They looked at it together, the field catching the first low light of a March morning, the whole ordinary, improbable fact of a thing that had been written off growing anyway. The house behind them was still sleeping. In an hour it would be noise and movement and the particular controlled chaos of 6 boys starting a day. And the work would be exactly what it always was. Hard, unfinished, ongoing, real. But for this moment, the kitchen was quiet, and the field was green, and the key was on the nightstand upstairs, and this was the place she had come to, and she had stayed, and it had been worth it. Not because it was perfect, because it was hers.